the employee restroom. The heavy wooden door of the employee restroom clicked open, releasing Kira back into the hallway. 32 minutes had elapsed since she abruptly abandoned her prep station. She walked down the short corridor with her usual measured, deliberate steps, her gaze fixed securely on the worn linoleum floor. The ambient volume of Robin's diner had dropped significantly. The chaotic lunch rush had receded, leaving behind only the low hum of the commercial refrigerators and the sporadic clinking of silverware from the few remaining occupied booths. Kira returned to her station. She immediately began realigning her tools, ensuring the metal tongs were exactly parallel to the edge of the stainless steel tray. Jessie was standing near the espresso machine, wiping down the steam wand with a damp cloth. He maintained a respectful distance, deliberately keeping his movements slow and predictable so as not to startle her. Mrs. Henderson was at the far end of the counter, quietly tallying receipts, her gray hair secured in its tight bun, acting as a silent sentinel over the calm dining room. Jessie rinsed the cloth in the sink, hesitating for only a fraction of a second before turning toward Kira. He did not cross the invisible boundary of her workspace, leaning casually against the back counter instead. He kept his voice low, gentle, and entirely devoid of judgment. "Are you feeling better?" Jessie asked. Kira paused her realignment process, her fingers hovering over a stack of paper napkins. She did not make eye contact, focusing instead on the stitching of his maroon and yellow apron. "My physiological needs have been addressed. My baseline is restored. However, I owe you an apology. My sudden departure violated standard operational procedure and created a localized scene. I understand that disrupted your workflow." "You don't ever have to apologize for taking care of yourself, Kira," Jessie said firmly, offering a soft, reassuring smile that she could see in her peripheral vision. "You didn't make a scene. The guy in the suit made a scene." Kira considered this data point, her brow furrowing slightly. His reaction was disproportionate to the delay in service. "It definitely was," Jessie agreed. He leaned a little closer, his tone shifting into one of genuine curiosity. "I have to admit, though, I've been thinking about what you called him. I don't think I've ever heard the phrase normal freak before." Kira blinked, her hands finally resting on the counter. She seemed to calculate whether sharing this information was safe, running his past behavior through her internal filters. He had proven to be consistently respectful. "When I was younger, in the special education wing, the other special needs students, and I used to refer to the mainstream students as perfect. It was the standard terminology we used to differentiate them from us." Jessie frowned slightly, his heart aching at the implications of the word. "Why perfect?" "Because they did not require accommodations. But as I grew older and expanded my anthropological observations, I realized that vocabulary was fundamentally flawed," Kira explained, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a lecture. "Designating them as perfect established a baseline where we were inherently defective. It conceded power to them before any interaction even began. It gave them an unearned psychological advantage. So I changed the terminology." Jessie nodded slowly, captivated by the absolute logic of her self-preservation. "You started calling them normal people." "Yes, normal people is the new term. It is a more accurate demographic descriptor. It removes the artificial hierarchy," Kira stated, finally glancing up to meet his big brown eyes for a fleeting second. "Consequently, a normal freak is someone who falls within the neurotypical median but exhibits highly erratic, socially disruptive, and hostile behavior, like yelling at a diner employee over a biological necessity." Jessie chuckled softly, a warm sound that seemed to ease the lingering tension in the air. "It's a highly accurate assessment." "I am still sorry for the disruption," Kira added, looking back down at the counter. "Kira, listen to me," Jessie said, his voice dropping into a register of quiet intensity. "You never have to defend yourself in here. To be honest, I was about 3 seconds away from stepping over the counter and talking to him myself. Kira tilted her head, confused. Talking. Well, politely asking him to leave, Jessie clarified, his jaw tightening briefly at the memory of the man's insult. And then, less politely, telling him exactly what I thought of his word choice. Nobody gets to speak to you like that while I'm around. I was ready to throw him out. Kira stared at his apron strings, processing this new input. Jessie was not just accommodating her. He was actively willing to engage in social conflict to protect her dignity. It was a variable she had rarely encountered in normal people. An hour drifted by. The heavy gray clouds outside finally broke, allowing pale afternoon sunlight to filter through the diner's large front windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The rhythm of the diner was entirely steady. Kira was counting a fresh sleeve of takeaway cups when the bell above the door jingled sharply. Jessie looked up from the register. His shoulders immediately went rigid. It was the man in the rumpled gray suit. Jessie stepped out from behind the register, moving to block the aisle that led to Kira's prep station. Mrs. Henderson stopped wiping down the pie display, her eyes narrowing as she watched the man approach. But the man did not look angry. His face was flushed, his posture slumped, and he was clutching a small, clear plastic bakery bag sealed with a gold twist tie. He stopped a few feet away from Jessie, looking distinctly uncomfortable. He bypassed Jessie's protective stance entirely and looked directly at Kira, who had stopped counting the cups. "Look, miss," the man said, his voice completely lacking its previous booming arrogance. It was quiet, almost entirely stripped of confidence. "I had a really terrible morning. I've been driving for 6 hours, my business meeting went south, and I took it out on you. That was wrong. What I called you was completely out of line." Kira stood completely still, her hazel eyes wide, silently cataloging his facial microexpressions. The man stepped forward hesitantly and placed the unopened bag of bakery cookies on the edge of her prep station. "I bought these from the bakery down the street. I wanted to apologize. I'm really sorry for how I acted." Without waiting for a response, the man turned around, gave a brief, apologetic nod to Jessie and Mrs. Henderson, and hurried out the front door. The bell jingled one last time before the diner fell completely silent. Jessie let out a long breath, his tense muscles relaxing. He turned to look at Kira, expecting her to be relieved. Instead, she was staring at the bag of cookies as if it were a highly volatile explosive device. "I am entirely confused," Kira announced, her voice tight with bewilderment. "This breaks my established algorithms." "What do you mean?" Jessie asked softly. Kira pointed a rigid finger at the cookies. "He initiated an unprovoked verbal assault to establish dominance. That is a known, aggressive neurotypical behavior pattern. Now, he has returned, admitted fault, surrendered his dominant position, and provided a caloric offering. Why would a normal freak willingly return to the site of an established conflict just to lower his own social standing?" Jessie walked over, stopping just outside her personal space, and looked at the cookies, then up at her genuinely perplexed face. "Sometimes, Kira, people just realize they made a mistake, and sometimes they actually want to fix it." Kira frowned deeply, crossing her arms over her green sweater. "Normal people are exceptionally contradictory. I do not trust this data." The clear plastic bakery bag sat on the stainless steel counter, catching the pale afternoon light that slanted through the diner windows. The gold twist tie glinted, sealing in the assortment of thick, chocolate-studded discs. To Jessie, it looked like a simple, somewhat pathetic peace offering. To Kira, it was an unexploded ordnance. "I think he genuinely felt bad," Jessie offered, keeping his voice carefully modulated so it wouldn't echo off the kitchen tiles. He leaned against the edge of the prep area, maintaining that crucial buffer of physical space she required. "Maybe we should just open them. We could split them. A peace offering isn't much good if it just sits there getting stale." Kira did not blink. She took a half step backward, creating more distance between herself and the baked goods. I cannot authorize the consumption of an unverified substance provided by a hostile variable, she stated, her tone flat but laced with underlying anxiety. There is historical precedent for caution. In 2014, at a gaming convention in a major metropolitan area, a seemingly benign individual distributed baked goods to attendees. The items had been deliberately tainted with a chemical laxative. The resulting chaos was medically significant and highly documented. The perpetrator used a disarming social gesture to inflict mass humiliation. Jessie absorbed the grim anecdote without a hint of a smile. He knew better than to dismiss her fears as irrational. To her, the world was a labyrinth of hidden traps, and her meticulously gathered data points were her only map. "Okay," he said slowly, nodding in acknowledgement. "That is a valid historical precedent. I can understand why you would flag this as a potential hazard. Furthermore, the bakery of origin is easily identifiable," Kira continued, her eyes darting to the sticker on the bottom of the bag. "Sugar me sweet. It is located 4 blocks south of our current coordinates. I am acquainted with the proprietor, a woman named Beatrice, whose nephew is in the same occupational therapy group as my former neighbor. I possess the capability to call the establishment and cross-reference the transaction. I can verify if a male matching his description purchased this specific inventory within the last 45 minutes. Jessie waited, watching the rapid calculations race behind her hazel eyes. He was ready to hand her the diner's cordless phone, fully prepared to support her investigative protocol. But Kira did not move toward the wall-mounted receiver. Instead, her posture shifted. The rigid lines of her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. She turned her gaze away from the bag and looked directly at Jessie. The intensity of her stare was absolute, stripping away the ambient noise of the humming refrigerators and the distant traffic outside. "However," Kira said, her voice dropping into a quieter, more uncertain register, "I recognize that my threat detection algorithms run at an inherently elevated baseline. You do not operate with the same constant expectation of malice." "I don't," Jessie agreed softly, "but my baseline isn't the one we have to follow." "You have consistently demonstrated reliability," Kira observed, her fingers twisting the hem of her oversized green sweater. "You did not mock my physiological emergency. You were prepared to initiate a confrontation, to defend my dignity. These actions place you outside the standard parameters of a normal freak." She swallowed hard, a rare display of physical nervousness. "You have entered my inner circle of trusted variables. Therefore, I am transferring the executive decision to you. If you determine the caloric offering is safe, I will accept your assessment." The weight of her statement hit Jessie squarely in the chest. It was a profound, terrifying honor. She was handing him the keys to her sanctuary, trusting him to discern friend from foe. He felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of protectiveness. He could not let her down, and he certainly could not let her face the hypothetical danger alone. "All right," Jessie said, his tone resolute. He stepped forward and reached for the gold twist tie. "If I'm making the call, then I'm also taking the point. I'll be the guinea pig. I will eat the first cookie. If I drop dead, you have my full permission to call Beatrice and tell her the gray suit guy is a murderer." A soft, dry chuckle drifted over from the cash register. Mrs. Henderson had been standing silently by the display case, a maroon cloth resting idle in her weathered hands. "You know, Kira," the older woman said, her voice rich with decades of quiet observation, "Jessie has a good point. And despite what your research says, not all normal people are monsters. Some of them just have bad days, realize they acted like fools, and try to make amends. I vote in favor of sharing the cookies." Kira looked at Mrs. Henderson, then back to Jessie, who was already untwisting the gold wire. The tension in the air dissolved, replaced by a tentative, fragile warmth. Okay, Kira finally agreed, exhaling a long, measured breath. Let's share them, but you must consume the first unit in its entirety before I engage. Jessie smiled, pulling a heavy chocolate chip cookie from the plastic. He took a large, deliberate bite, chewing with exaggerated thoughtfulness while Kira scrutinized him for any signs of immediate toxicity. He swallowed, held his hands up in mock surrender, and declared it safe. Satisfied, Kira reached into the bag, carefully extracting a cookie whose chocolate distribution appeared the most symmetrical. For the next 10 minutes, the diner was an oasis of quiet camaraderie. They ate their sweet peace offerings in comfortable silence, the shared experience cementing the bridge that had been slowly building between them over the past week. Jessie felt the lingering frost of his past betrayal melting away. He had found a place where he mattered, where his actions held weight, and where trust was a currency earned through consistent, genuine care. Then, the silver bell above the front door jingled sharply. Jessie turned, a welcoming greeting halfway up his throat, expecting to see a local fisherman or a late afternoon tourist seeking refuge from the autumn chill. The greeting died instantly. The blood drained from his face, leaving a cold, sickening hollow in his stomach. Standing in the entryway, shivering slightly in a stylish trench coat that looked absurdly out of place in Gimli, was a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a hesitant, practiced smile. It was her, the epicenter of his heartbreak, the very reason he had fled Winnipeg in the middle of the night. "Jessie," she called out, her voice echoing too loudly in the quiet diner. I finally found you." Behind the counter, Kira stopped chewing. She registered the immediate, catastrophic shift in Jessie's posture. The rigid spine, the shallow breathing, the sudden loss of color. Her hazel eyes darted between Jessie and the newcomer. Her threat detection algorithms, dormant only moments ago, flared back to life with blinding intensity. The fragile trust she had just extended fractured as she took a slow, deliberate step backward into the shadows of the kitchen doorway. Her sanctuary suddenly breached by an utterly unpredictable and devastating new variable. The air in the diner turned to lead. Jessie gripped the edge of the stainless steel counter, his knuckles turning white as the blood rushed from his extremities. The gold-tied bag of bakery cookies, sitting on the prep station, suddenly felt like a relic from a completely different, safer universe. The woman standing by the front door, framed by the flickering neon glow of the open sign, belonged exclusively to the life he had desperately driven away from. Darcy's expensive floral perfume wafted into the space, clashing violently with the comforting, reliable aromas of dark roast coffee and toasted flour. She offered a fragile, trembling smile, pulling her stylish trench coat tighter around her waist as she shivered in the autumn chill. "What are you doing here?" Jessie asked. His voice was completely devoid of the tentative warmth he had shared with Kira just moments before. It sounded hollow, scraped clean by the sudden, suffocating return of his recent trauma. He did not move out from behind the counter, instinctively using the laminate surface as a physical barricade against the wreckage of his past. Darcy took a hesitant step forward, her high heels clicking sharply against the checkerboard linoleum. "I asked around," she said, her voice dropping into a pleading, practiced register. "Your brother finally told me you came up north. Jessie, please, She was interrupted by a deliberate, rhythmic squeak of rubber soles. From the shadows of the kitchen doorway, Kira emerged. Her threat detection algorithms had initially driven her backward into the safety of the corridor, but a deeply ingrained behavioral protocol was currently overriding her overwhelming flight response. Rule number 4 from her early integration therapy explicitly stated that when a new individual enters a closed social environment, a formal introduction is required to establish baseline variables. Kira stopped precisely 3 feet from Darcy, maintaining a rigid, perfectly straight posture, her hands clamped tightly together in front of her oversized green sweater. "Hello," Kira stated, her voice flat, clear, and projected with deliberate volume. "My name is Kira. I am an employee of this establishment. What is your name?" Darcy blinked, completely derailed by the sudden intervention. She looked at Kira's blunt, unblinking hazel eyes, then glanced quickly at Jessie, clearly confused by the disruption. The newcomer visibly recalibrated her expression, evidently surprised by the immaculate, formal manners coming from the intense, red-haired woman standing directly in her path. "Oh," Darcy stammered, offering a bewildered, polite nod. My name is Darcy." "Acknowledged, Darcy," Kira replied with absolute finality. Having successfully executed the required social script, Kira executed a crisp turn on her heel and marched straight back into the kitchen without another word. Once behind the heavy swinging door, Kira looked up at the analog clock mounted directly above the commercial fryers. The red second hand swept smoothly past the 12. It was exactly 4 o'clock. Her shift was officially over. She moved to the employee lockers with mechanical efficiency, retrieving her worn canvas tote bag and slipping her arms into her heavy winter jacket. From the front counter, she could hear the muffled, tense exchange beginning to escalate. She pulled a blue pen from her jacket pocket, tore a blank strip of thermal paper from the spare receipt roll sitting on the shelf, and carefully wrote down a precise sequence of 10 digits. Out in the main dining area, Darcy had closed the distance to the counter. "Jessie, I just want to talk to you," she pleaded, reaching out to touch the laminate surface, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling. "I drove all the way up here because I can't leave things the way they ended. I need you to understand." "There is nothing to talk about," Jessie said, his tone icy and resolute. He took a deliberate step back, ensuring she couldn't reach across the counter to touch him. The deep compassion he naturally possessed was entirely locked away, heavily guarded by the fresh, agonizing memory of his devastated apartment in Winnipeg. "You made your choice. You should go back to Marco." Darcy flinched as if she had been physically struck. The mention of his name hung in the diner air, toxic and heavy. "It wasn't like that," she insisted, tears welling rapidly in her eyes, blurring her dark mascara. "Please, Jessie, just listen. You don't even have to speak. Just give me 5 minutes to explain my side." Before Jessie could flatly deny her request, the kitchen door swung open again. Kira walked briskly past the espresso machine. She did not look at Darcy. She marched directly up to Jessie, invading his immediate proximity just enough to press the small, curled strip of receipt paper directly into his palm. She did not verbally explain the numbers or offer a standard parting greeting. Having delivered the critical data, Kira turned and walked rapidly out the front door, the silver bell jingling frantically as she stepped out into the sharp, biting wind blowing off Lake Winnipeg, beginning her solitary walk home. Jessie looked down at the thermal paper, his thumb gently brushing over the carefully penned digits. It was an anchor, a fragile lifeline from a girl who fiercely guarded her own trust, offering it to him in his moment of extreme vulnerability. He closed his fist tightly around it, sliding the paper safely into his jeans pocket. He looked at Darcy, then glanced at Mrs. Henderson, who was quietly wiping down the register, her posture radiating a steady, quiet support. 5 minutes, Jessie said to Darcy, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Outside, Mrs. Henderson needs to lock up. They stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk. The Gimli air was brutally cold, carrying the damp, metallic scent of the massive lake and the faint smell of decaying autumn leaves. Darcy launched into her prepared monologue, her words spilling out in a frantic, rehearsed rush. She spoke of profound loneliness, of temporary lapses in judgment, of how Marco was merely a catastrophic mistake born of her own deep-seated insecurity. She cried openly, her shoulders shaking violently beneath her expensive designer coat. Jessie stood entirely still, his hands buried deep in his pockets, listening exactly as requested. But as her words washed over him, he realized with startling clarity that he felt absolutely nothing. The agonizing, suffocating heartbreak that had driven him blindly from the city had completely calcified. Watching her desperately perform her grief, he realized he was no longer the same fractured man she had betrayed. His healing had already taken root here, amidst bitter dark roast coffee, meticulously strict routines, and brutally honest conversations about normal freaks. The conversation was failing rapidly. Darcy could easily see the dead, unresponsive look in his wide brown eyes. Panic set in. Her dramatic apologies weren't working. Her tears weren't breaking his firm resolve. Desperate to bridge the massive, invisible canyon she had created between them, she lunged forward. She grabbed the lapels of his jacket, pulled herself forcefully against his chest, and mashed her mouth onto his. It was a violent, entirely unwelcome intrusion of his space. Jessie recoiled instantly, his hands coming up immediately to shove her forcefully backward. He wiped the back of his hand aggressively across his mouth, his face twisted in profound disgust and absolute rejection. "Don't ever touch me again," Jessie warned, his voice low, steady, and extremely dangerous, carrying an absolute finality that brooked no further argument. He did not wait for her theatrical tears to renew, nor did he linger to hear another hollow, desperate apology. He turned his back completely on the ghost of his past. With his fingers resting securely in his pocket, wrapped tightly around the small slip of thermal paper bearing Kiera's phone number, Jessie walked steadily away into the cold, cleansing northern wind, leaving Darcy standing entirely alone on the empty pavement. The freezing